beer and the Hofbraeuhaus. They've belonged together for the past 400 years. Since the early 19th century, the famous beer cellar at the heart of Munich has been a magnet for the locals as well as visitors from all over the world. The tasty beers, the traditional specialties, the history of the Hofbraeuhaus and its legendary Gemütlichkeit have made it the most famous beer cellar in the world. The name Hofbräuhaus actually means court brewery, but the place has never been all that grand. Once a humble street pub, and now the most celebrated beer cellar in the world, it has retained its character as a simple, down-to-earth pub with rustic charm. For the 100 waiters and waitresses, the working day here begins at 7 a.m. The doors open to the public from 9 a.m. onward. The Hofbräuhaus is open every day of the week, even at Christmas time, and on busy days it can cater to up to 30,000 visitors. Margareta Batzhuber was born in Munich and is one of the numerous friendly waitresses. She's 73 years old. That makes her the oldest waitress in the place. At the heart of the Hofbräuhaus is the busy area called the Schwemme, or tap room, and that's where she likes working most. She's an intuitive judge of character, and her friendly ways and keen instincts have made her very popular with her colleagues and regular guests. She could actually have retired years ago, but life without the Hofbräuhaus is something she can't even begin to imagine. For her, the famous beer cellar has become a second home.
Ich bin seit knapp 20 Jahren im Hofbraeuhaus und ich liebe das, unter Menschen zu sein, und ich bin mit Leidenschaft Bedienung.
Over a century ago, brewing equipment used to stand here. Today, the so-called Schwemme, or tap room, can accommodate over 1,000 people. Half of the people who come here are daily regulars. And one of them is actually an angel, if the famous fairy tale about the man from Munich who went to heaven is to be believed. Alois Hingerl, the main figure in the story, was a regular at the Hofbräuhaus all his life. When he died and arrived in heaven, he irritated a lot of people there by being so homesick for Munich. He moaned so much that eventually God decided to have mercy on him and sent him back to his old home on a mission for the Bavarian government. But the moment Angel Alois smelt the air of Munich again, he forgot all about his divine mission and flew straight off to the Hofbräuhaus. There he finally found peace of mind and has been enjoying one beer after the other ever since. And to this day, so runs the tale, the Bavarian government has been waiting in vain for divine inspiration. 500 years ago, hardly anyone would have had the idea of ascribing heavenly qualities to Bavarian beer. Up to that time, to improve the taste, all kinds of experiments had been carried out with extra ingredients that included not only herbs, but also ox's gallbladders, pitch, and calves' feet. Drinking beer like this could sometimes actually be fatal. In the old days, beer here in Bavaria was not just thought of as a drink, but as a basic foodstuff. In 1516, the authorities issued a special brewing law for the whole of Bavaria.
Wir wollen auch sonderlichen, dass für allenthalben in unseren Städten, Märkten und auf dem Lande zu keinem Bier mehrer Stück dann Gersten, Hopfen und Wasser genommen und gebraucht werden solle.
It was the first foodstuff legislation in the world, and it still applies today. We now call it the Reinheitsgebot, or Beer Purity Law. Anyone who contravened it was severely punished. This merciless policy formed the basis of Bavarian beer's international reputation later on. The law was beneficial not only to good health, but also to the Bavarian economy. Strict control of the ingredients meant that the breweries could be taxed, and the state's coffers could be filled. There once was a Duke of Bavaria who suffered from terrible thirst. he had a whole retinue of servants whose thirst was most tragically worse. That late 16th century Munich rhyme ridiculed the drinking habits of the ducal court. Wilhelm V, the ruler at that time, discovered that having 700 courtiers was a highly expensive affair. There was not enough privately brewed beer in Munich for the court's needs, so he had an especially fine table beer imported from the Dutch Hanseatic town of Einbeck. In the long term, this became very expensive. Wilhelm V decided to save himself money, and on September 27, 1589, he founded a brown beer brewery especially for the court, in the grounds of the Munich royal residence of that time. This first hofbraeuhaus, or court brewery, lasted until 1808, and was only a few steps away from today's hofbraeuhaus. All that remains of it today is its certificate of foundation. To begin with, the Duke's first brown beer brewery suffered from a lack of know-how, and his obsequious courtiers continued to insist on the imported beer. So, during the first few years, the very primitively brewed brown beer was served to the court servants, who had to pay for it with beer tokens. Weissbier, a top-fermented beer made from barley and wheat, existed at that time too, but it contravened the beer purity law, and ordinary people were forbidden to drink it. Only the barons of Degenberg had ducal permission to brew it. In 1602, the last Baron of Degenberg died, and the Weissbier privilege fell to the House of Wittelsbach again. Soon afterwards, plans were made for the construction of a second hofbraeuhaus opposite the old Orlando House in the small square called the Platzl. It was commissioned by Maximilian I, Bavaria's new ruler. In 1607, he built his ducal Weissbier brewery, thus laying the historical foundations of today's hofbraeuhaus. Fizzy Weissbier was considered a luxury beverage, and was especially popular with the ladies of the court. Alleging that it gave their skin a rosy sheen, they apparently consumed vast quantities of it, until one day the authorities put a stop to these excesses and issued a decree: no more than 4 liters of beer a day and a maximum of 3 per evening for ladies of noble birth. Whatever the court was keen on was even more popular with the people. With the Weissbier privilege in his pocket, Maximilian could finance his brewing. He now allowed his subjects access to the fashionable beverage too. But anyone who wanted to serve Weissbier in public places either had to obtain it directly from the court or pay very high duties for brewing rights. With his Weissbier monopoly, Maximilian I successfully filled the state coffers and was also able to afford new weapons for the 30 Years' War. Against the overwhelming forces of Sweden, Munich beer turned out to be far more useful than weapons. 362 buckets of strong beer from the hofbraeuhaus pacified the invaders and spared the city. A well-informed brewer from Einbeck began brewing delicious Einbeck beer in the brown hofbraeuhaus from 1614 onward, where it gradually became known as Bock beer. This was Munich's first ever Bock beer, and from 1638 the common people were allowed to taste it once a year on Corpus Christi. The actual brewing of the beer remained a court privilege until 1818, however. The Gemütlichkeit of the Hofbräuhaus may have contributed to this particular musician's eagerness to begin his career in the royal capital of Munich. But to his great disappointment, the court politely sent him packing, as he wrote to his father. His opera Idomeneo premiered at Munich's Cuveliers Theater, however, in January 1781. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart found consolation after his rejection in the humble rooms of the Electoral Brewery and wrote a short poem. In Munich, I once did lodge and played a concert at its court. I composed the opera Idomeneo in 1780 and restored myself in the Elector's alehouse and had primo fun with all the guests there, as I guess you can deduce from this note here. Around 50 years later, the Hofbraeuhaus and the new Munich Opera House would make collective history. On the night of January 14th, 1823, the National Theatre caught fire and threatened to burn down completely, since the fire department's water during that harsh winter was completely frozen. Help arrived from the neighboring breweries and from the Hofbraeuhaus. Beer was quickly brought round in large vats, and the opera house was saved from total destruction. The price of beer rose as a result of this, but the people of Munich took it in their stride. The two ducal breweries at the Old Court and in the Platzl had now become electoral ones. When Bavaria became a kingdom in 1806, the breweries were renamed Royal Court Breweries. But Munich's taste in beer had changed in the meantime. Weissbier was selling badly, and it was brown beer that was enjoying newfound popularity. In 1808, therefore, the Weissbier and brown beer breweries were integrated into the Weissbier brewery founded by Maximilian I on the Platzl, which went on to produce mainly brown beer. In 1828, to the disappointment of the local publicans, who were worried about their custom, King Ludwig I decreed that the court alehouse was henceforth to be a people's alehouse. For the citizens of Munich, the start of innkeeping as a business was a cause for great celebration, as a contemporary described. Ever since the Hofbraeuhaus was built, there had probably been no greater rejoicing within its walls than on that day. All the beer mugs of the many guests were quickly adorned with wax candles, and the portrait of the king was brought in and adorned with garlands, illuminating the entire establishment in a most pleasing manner. Today's regulars in the Hofbraeuhaus still commemorate that great day with a celebratory toast. The Bavarians are a gruff but good-natured people. They would sooner chop firewood than start an uprising, but take away or water down their beer, and they will rebel far more wildly than any other people, ran an article in a French newspaper of 1844. Price rises for beer brought the Bavarian population to the barricades. In the 19th century, Bavaria was embroiled in a real beer war. The Hofbräuhaus remained an oasis of peace in the midst of all the fighting. Since it was directly answerable to the royal household, it was less dependent on profit than the private breweries. When they raised their beer prices in 1844, King Ludwig I made up for it by lowering the Hofbräuhaus beer price by 1 Kreutzer, in order to offer the army and the working class a healthy and inexpensive beverage. This began a tradition. A liter mug of beer has always been slightly cheaper here. The decor was initially Spartan, but that didn't stop even crowned heads from visiting now and then. The Empress Elizabeth of Austria, Sissi, was one of the most famous guests at the Platzl. When she visited her Bavarian homeland, she enjoyed dropping in to enjoy a few swigs of Munich beer here, in the relaxed and comfortable surroundings. In 1607, when the Hofbräuhaus was enlarged for the first time, space was needed for brewing equipment. At the end of the 19th century, a lot more space was needed for guests. In 1882, the brewery was shifted to the banks of Munich's river Isar. With a final swig of beer on May the 22nd, 1896, the people of Munich bade farewell to their old Hofbräuhaus on the Platzl. The Bavarian state spent over 800,000 gold marks on converting the simple pub into a beer palace. The plan was to build a beer temple It would be based on all the latest findings in the mass catering trade and was planned by an architect from Saxony, Max Littmann. The architect not only immortalized himself with the design of the new Hofbraeuhaus, the Orlando house opposite was also based on his plans. But before then, on September 22, 1897, the new beer palace on the Platzl opened its doors. Despite being able to accommodate 3,500 guests, the new Hofbraeuhaus had lost none of its former charm. At the turn of the century, the place already had 5,000 regular customers. Not only people from Munich either. Travelers came here in droves from all over the world. The pub became a famous Munich site and a meeting place for people of all nations, of all ages, and from every social class. Military generals sit beside ordinary clerks, town councillors beside porters, and rich aristocrats beside plebeians. Only here can you find true liberty, equality, and fraternity, ran an enthusiastic article in the Frankfurter Zeitung of 1894. With such a crush of visitors, waitresses were more in demand than ever. They were often idealized as the heart and soul of the place, but the reality was different. During the so-called good old days around the turn of the century, women and girls from poor families were the only ones to enter into waitress service. There was no shortage of job vacancies, but wages were very low. In the year 1905, a waitress's daily wage amounted to roughly 50 pfennigs a day, equivalent to the price of 2 liters of beer. The women made most of their money from gratuities. If guests needed salt, pepper, matches, or toothpicks, the waitresses were expected to pay for them out of their own pockets. The girls who washed the beer mugs and any breakages also had to be paid for by the waitresses. A working day at the Hofbraeuhaus at that time lasted from 7 in the morning till 1 o'clock at night. Waitresses only had time off once or twice a month for a maximum of 8 hours. Since those pioneering days of the catering trade, the customs and traditions at the Hofbraeuhaus have become a lot more sophisticated, not least in terms of food quality. In the old days, hot meals were only available here in the evenings. During the day, all the guests got with their beer were pretzels and radishes, served up more or less appetizingly. Today, even the simplest snack from the Hofbraeuhaus kitchen is a minor work of art in its own right. Whether in the tap room, the saloon, or under the shady chestnut trees in the beer garden, the Hofbraeuhaus is a great place to be, whatever the season, whatever the weather, and whatever the time of day. These days, Bavarian specialties are served from dawn till late at night, and early in the morning, a very special Munich specialty is freshly produced here. So special, in fact, that a lot of connoisseurs come here as early as breakfast time. Four o'clock in the morning is when production of homemade Weisswurst, or white sausage, begins at the Hofbraeuhaus. This Munich delicacy was invented on a Sunday in 1857 during carnival time by a local butcher, and is an essential item on the Hofbraeuhaus menu. A sausage like this has to contain 70% veal and 30% pork by law. As far as the seasoning is concerned, each butcher has his own very secret recipe. The ones at the Hofbraeuhaus seem to be especially delicious. If you put all the Weisswurst sausages consumed here in 1 year end to end, they'd cover a distance of 20 kilometers. Weisswurst is served with fresh pretzels and sweet mustard, and an old Munich tradition dictates that it should be eaten before the church bells ring 12 noon. Anyone who starts getting looks of amusement or even annoyance from local people at neighboring tables is probably doing something wrong. Munich people are very serious about Weisswurst eating and very sensitive to criticism, which is rather strange because they can't even agree among themselves whether the sausage should be eaten with a knife and fork, skinned lengthwise, or just picked up in the fingers and sucked. However it's done, asking locals about the right method is a great way of getting into conversation with them. If you don't want to be outed as a non-local, however, it's best to stick with the other specialties on the hofbraeuhaus menu. For lovers of hearty Bavarian food, this place is paradise on earth. An essential element of it all is the dumpling, which comes in various flavors. Each year, hungry guests consume 160,000 potato dumplings alone, and every single dumpling is still lovingly made by hand. The tasty crackling on the suckling pig and the joints and knuckles of pork are the pride of the chef, who bases his inspirations on ancient Bavarian recipes passed down over the years. However busy the place is, the employees here are always on top of the situation, especially Stilla Weiss. She began working here as a kitchen assistant during the early 1960s. Today she's far more senior, and for many backstage, she's the life and soul of the place. Before any dish is taken to a table, she checks it to see that everything is just right. In the old days, the size of a waitress's gratuity was also measured by how quickly she managed to organize beer mugs for her guests during busy periods. Those who went off to get their mugs in person usually had to pay a little less for the beer. There was a good reason for this. Sometimes people required not only willpower, but also a powerful pair of fists. Today, no one needs to fight for a mug of beer anymore. Old established regulars enjoy other privileges, such as a special compartment for their own beer mug inside a special beer mug safe. Anyone who wants one of these has to be very lucky indeed. They have to inherit a key from a dynasty of regulars. It's definitely a private party.
Die Jahreszahl 1948 bedeutet, dass ich seit 1948 im Herbst hier ins Hofbraeuhaus gehe und einen damals schon mit einem Stammtisch gegründet habe.
Ludwig Eidelsberger has been a regular customer here for almost 60 years. Over that time, the image of the Hofbraeuhaus has improved in some respects.
Die Schwemme war damals, ich sage einmal ein bisschen beim Münchner im Verruf. Leute hat es gegeben, die haben die Nase gerümpft, wenn man gesagt hat, im Hofbraeuhaus in der Schwemme habe ich einen Stammtisch.
In the Hofbraeuhaus, traditions have been cherished for ages, and ancient rituals have sometimes been brought back to life. A recent tradition at the regulars' table, for instance, is to pay for your beer not with money, but with beer tokens, just like the old days when the Duke ran the place. Any regular who buys 10 tokens at once gets an 11th for free. Tradition is certainly very important here, and that goes for the small print too. During the 19th century, ambitious brewers were quite happy to copy the successful and world-famous symbol of the Hofbraeuhaus. Plagiarism like this only ended in 1879, when the trademark, consisting of a crown with the letters H and B, was finally registered at the Imperial Patent Office in Berlin. In 1913, when the Russian revolutionary leader Lenin visited the Hofbraeuhaus with his wife Nadezhda, they noticed that the letters H and B in the trademark corresponded to the Cyrillic N and V. Lenin liked to think that this stood for Narodnaya Volya, or the will of the people. His wife wrote fondly in her reminiscences, "We have especially happy memories of the Hofbraeuhaus, where the good beer removes all class differences." More than 50 years before Lenin visited the place, Berlin author Paul Heise came to a similar conclusion. He happily noticed that the democratic power of beer really did bring people together. Equality before the national drink mitigated social pressures and differences. The Hofbraeuhaus has always been a meeting place for the wealthy and successful, as well as the poor and unsuccessful. When the economic depression hit in the 1920s, an increasing number of penniless artists came here looking for wealthy customers. The artist Franz Mandlinger spent 12 hours a day here. For 50 pfennigs, the price of a liter of beer at that time, he painted portraits of ordinary people as well as celebrities, such as Josephine Baker or Ivar Kreuger, the matchstick millionaire. Like the famous dancer, the Swede Ivar Kreuger was also a guest at the Hofbraeuhaus during the Golden 20s. People of his social standing preferred to visit the nobler upper levels of the beer hall. As the owner of a matchstick factory, Kreuger became incredibly successful throughout Europe and was later immortalized in literature, films, and plays as the prototype capitalist. His company signed a match monopoly agreement with Germany in 1929 that was valid until 1983. In return, Kreuger granted the country a long-term state loan of over 500 million Reichsmarks. After the Wall Street crash of 1929, Ivar Kreuger lost most of his fortune and committed suicide 3 years later in Paris. On the second level of the beer palace, concerts often took place in front of large audiences. In 1900, the magnificent banqueting hall, designed by architect Max Littmann, was one of the finest contemporary structures in the city and is still an important architectural site today. An area measuring over 700 square meters is roofed over by a 9-meter-high barrel vault made of steel. Littmann envisioned it as a place of noisy celebration, but the huge hall was soon a popular location for mass political meetings. For the first time, the Hofbräuhaus was becoming an uncomfortable place. It was here on February 24, 1920, in front of 2,000 supporters, that Adolf Hitler announced the party program of the NSDAP. While the self-appointed Führer screamed himself hoarse and drank only mineral water, a vast amount of beer ensured that his listeners remained enthusiastic. The banqueting hall was not spared from the destructive consequences of his policies. On April 25, 1944, when the first bomb hit the beer palace, the Hofbräuhaus artist Franz Mandlinger was utterly despondent. "Now they've taken away the basis of my existence. I have nothing left in the entire world," he complained. 4 weeks later, the 77-year-old painter died in a dilapidated house in the Munich district of Au. Further bombing raids destroyed 60% of the Hofbräuhaus. In May 1945, U.S. soldiers marched into the ruined city of Munich and finally freed Germany from Nazi tyranny. Even before the currency reform of 1948, the first dances were already taking place at the Hofbraeuhaus. Watered-down beer, in exchange for bread tokens, kept people in good spirits. In 1950, the citizens of Munich began rebuilding their ancient institution. In its 4 centuries of history, the beer palace on the Platzl has given us all kinds of happy, exciting, and also sad stories. Once a court brewery run by a duke, it has become synonymous with Bavarian beer culture. As an electoral, royal, and later state-run inn, the Hofbraeuhaus has become the international symbol of Bavarian joy in life. Ever since the 19th century, the Hofbraeuhaus has been a magnet for international visitors, and the people of Munich are as happy as ever with it. Its proverbial Gemütlichkeit and down-to-earth image have made it the most famous beer hall in the world. But the Hofbraeuhaus is far more than just a beer hall. It's a phenomenon that is typically Bavarian.